Millionaire marries a McDonald's worker because of a bet and gets surprised when, on a chilly night in New York City, the heart of the metropolis beat as always, even under the light drizzle that glistened on Manhattan's sidewalks. Amid the bustling streets, the McDonald's in Times Square was as busy as ever. Emma Carter, her professional smile in place and her brown hair tied up in a messy bun, was serving another customer. She knew she had to keep up the pace. At just 23 years old, her routine was grueling. She worked long hours at the restaurant to fund her literature studies at NYU and support her mother, who was battling multiple sclerosis. This job was a necessity, not a choice. Yet Emma never complained. She knew her determination was the only thing keeping her going. As Emma handed over an order, the door to the restaurant swung open, letting in the cold along with a group of rowdy young men. At the center of the group stood Blake Harrison. Dressed in a designer coat, he seemed out of place in the humble fast food joint. Blake, 28, was the heir to one of the largest tech companies in the US. He was used to luxury, not places like this. But tonight, he was there for a reason that even he found ridiculous. "This is the spot?" he asked, glancing around and addressing his friends. "Of course, remember the bet? You said you'd marry the next person we found working in some random place. And here we are," said Tom, his childhood friend, laughing. Blake rolled his eyes. The bet had seemed like a joke the night before while they were drinking at a bar near Central Park. But now, in the light of day, it felt like a mistake. Still, he was too proud to back down. "Fine, let's get this over with," Blake said with a self-assured grin. He walked up to the counter where Emma was arranging trays. When she looked at him, she instantly realized this customer was different. His confident posture and scrutinizing gaze made her uncomfortable. "Can I help you?" Emma asked, keeping her tone professional. Blake smiled, a smirk both cynical and intriguing. "Actually, yes. I'd like to marry you." For a moment, Emma's world seemed to stop. She blinked, thinking she must have misheard. "Excuse me, what?" Blake maintained his composure, as if he were saying something entirely normal. "You heard me. I want to marry you." Emma's co-workers burst out laughing, assuming it was a prank. But Emma didn't laugh. She frowned, crossing her arms. "Look, if this is some kind of joke, you picked the wrong person. I'm busy." Blake raised his hands as if to show he was being sincere. "It's not a joke, I'm serious. We can sort it out today." Emma shook her head in disbelief. It was obvious he wasn't serious. Who would say something so absurd? "Right. If you're not ordering a burger, maybe you should leave the line." Blake stepped away from the counter but didn't leave. He sat at a nearby table, watching Emma as she worked. She tried to ignore him, but his gaze was unwavering. When the rush finally subsided, Blake stood and approached the counter again. This time, he placed a credit card on the counter without a word. Emma stared at him, confused. "And this is for?" she asked. $100,000. "That's my offer for you to marry me," he said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. Emma felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not for sale. Now please leave before I call security." Blake didn't seem fazed. In fact, he looked even more intrigued. He wasn't used to hearing the word no. "All right, think about it. I'll be back tomorrow," he said, walking out and leaving the card on the counter. Emma looked at the card as if it was something poisonous. What was that man thinking? Who in their right mind would make such a proposal? But that night, back at her tiny apartment in Hoboken, Emma couldn't get the absurd proposition out of her mind. $100,000, that could fix so much. It would cover her mum's medical debts, help her finish school, and maybe even leave enough for her to focus on her writing, her true dream. Even so, the cost seemed far too high. The next day, Blake returned as he'd promised. He walked into the diner with the same confidence as before, but there was something different about his expression. He seemed more serious, less flippant. "Any decision?" he asked when he found Emma at the counter. She sighed, crossing her arms. "What do you really want? Why would you even do something like this?" Blake hesitated for a moment before giving a faintly melancholic smile. "I need to prove something. Not to you, but to myself." Emma shook her head. "That doesn't make sense." "Maybe not, but what if it did? To you?" He stared at her, and for a brief moment Emma felt there was something deeper to his proposal, something she didn't yet understand. And against all odds, Emma began to consider it. Emma spent the night wide awake, trying to forget the strange man and his ridiculous offer. She had more than enough to worry about. Her mother in Hoboken needed medications that kept getting more expensive. Her literature classes at NYU were a constant struggle to balance with her shifts at McDonald's, and her bank account was dangerously close to zero. Still, that absurd offer echoed in her mind. $100,000. It was enough money to solve so many problems, but the thought of marrying a complete stranger felt like a nightmare. The next morning, she arrived at the diner determined to avoid any interaction with Blake if he showed up again. But, as fate loves to interfere, he walked in at exactly 11 o'clock wearing another expensive suit and exuding that same infuriating confidence. "Good morning, Emma," he said, as if they were old friends. Emma felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Look, if you're here to make another scene, I suggest you leave. I have work to do." Blake raised his hands as if to defuse the situation. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I just want to talk." Emma ignored him, turning her attention to the next customer in line. Blake sighed but didn't leave. He ordered a coffee and sat at one of the tables near the counter as if prepared to wait all day. When the rush finally died down, Emma couldn't ignore him any longer. She approached the table, arms crossed, her expression impatient. "What do you want?" Blake looked up at her with a smile that seemed calculated. "I want you to say yes." Emma scoffed. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. Why are you so insistent?" Blake hesitated for a moment, as if he hadn't expected that question. "Because it's simple. You don't have to change your life and I need this to happen." "Why?" Emma asked, narrowing her eyes. Blake averted his gaze for a moment, as though considering how much honesty he could afford. "Let's just say I'm trying to prove something." Emma shook her head in disbelief. "That's not a reason. You don't understand what my life is like, or what this would mean for me. I'm not some piece in your game. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm offering you an opportunity." Emma felt a lump in her throat. He spoke as if he understood her situation, but clearly he knew nothing. "Just another rich man playing with other people's problems. I already said no. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important things to do." She turned and went back to the counter, leaving Blake standing alone. He watched her work, noticing the seriousness on her face. For the first time, something made him hesitate. It wasn't exactly guilt, but a sense that this wasn't going the way he had imagined. At the end of the day, while Emma was waiting in line at the subway, Blake showed up again. She almost ignored him, but he blocked her path. "I know you're tired of this, but just hear me out for one more minute," he said, his tone less arrogant this time. "Why?" Emma shot back, exhausted. "Why should I?" Blake took a deep breath, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "Because you could gain from this. I don't know what your life is like, but from what I've seen, it looks like you've got a lot on your plate. $100,000 could help, couldn't it?" Emma stopped. For the first time, he seemed a little more human, a little less unbearable, but it was still hard to believe this wasn't some kind of cruel joke. "You think money solves everything?" she asked, crossing her arms. Blake gave a humorless smile. "No, but it helps a lot." Emma didn't respond. She knew he was right, but that didn't make the situation any less absurd. "Just think about it," he insisted. "If you want to talk, I'll be here tomorrow." And with that, Blake walked away, leaving Emma alone with her doubts. 2 days later, Blake showed up again at the McDonald's, and Emma decided to put an end to this once and for all. "Fine. I'll listen to what you have to say, but that's it." Blake smiled, sitting at the same table as before. "It's not complicated. Just a contract. We get married, live separate lives, and you get paid at the end." "And what do you get out of this?" Emma asked, still suspicious. "A bit of peace, maybe," he said evasively. Emma knew he wasn't telling the whole truth, but decided not to push. "I want a contract," she said, "written with every detail spelled out." Blake agreed immediately. "It's already being prepared," Emma sighed. She was about to accept a proposal that went against everything she believed in, but deep down, she knew this was a chance to change her life. "All right, I accept," she finally said. Blake smiled, and for once there was no trace of sarcasm. "Then we have a deal." The next day they got married in a quiet ceremony at a courthouse in Brooklyn. Emma still didn't fully understand what had driven Blake to do this, but she knew her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. Emma's footsteps echoed on the wet sidewalk as she walked beside Blake after the wedding. The Brooklyn courthouse now seemed far away, almost like a bizarre dream. The contract she had signed was folded in her bag, but the weight of that decision felt more real with each passing second. Blake, on the other hand, walked with a relaxed posture like he had just closed an important deal. He guided her to the limousine waiting at the corner, opening the door with a polite gesture. "After you," he said, with an easy smile. Emma hesitated for a moment before getting in. The interior was luxurious, with pristine leather seats and a minibar gleaming under soft lighting. She immediately felt out of place. "Do you always travel like this, Mon?" she asked, glancing around. "Not always, but I thought today called for something special," Blake replied, leaning back in the opposite seat. Emma rolled her eyes. "Special? You have a strange definition of special." Blake chuckled, but before he could respond, the driver started moving. The silence between them was almost awkward. Emma tried to distract herself by staring out the window, but the idea of having just married a stranger made her question her sanity. "And now what?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Blake seemed surprised by the question, but quickly shrugged. Now we stick to the plan. You're moving into my apartment on the Upper East Side for a while, at least until people believe this is real. After that, you can go back to your life and I'll go back to mine. Emma frowned. And why exactly do you want it to seem real? Blake stayed quiet for a moment, gazing out the window as if carefully choosing his words. It's complicated. Complicated? That's not an answer, she said, crossing her arms. He exhaled deeply before finally turning to face her. My family, they've been pressuring me. They think I'll never take anything seriously, that I'll never commit. This is my way of proving them wrong. Emma stayed silent. She still didn't fully understand his motivations, but there was something genuine in his voice. This wasn't just a gamble for him. There was more at stake. So you used me to prove a point to your family? She asked, not bothering to hide her irritation. Technically, yes, but let's be clear. You're benefiting from this too, he countered, raising an eyebrow. Emma huffed. He wasn't wrong, but she didn't like admitting it. This is so selfish, she muttered, looking down at her hands in her lap. Maybe, but sometimes selfishness is necessary. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When they finally arrived at Blake's building, Emma couldn't hide her reaction. The glass skyscraper gleamed in the afternoon light, towering against the New York skyline. The doorman opened the door for them, greeting Blake by name, and Emma felt even more out of place. This is where you live? She asked, almost in disbelief. Blake smiled. Welcome to your new home. They rode a quiet elevator that took them directly to the penthouse. When the doors opened, Emma was speechless. The apartment was vast and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Central Park. The sleek, modern furniture looked more like a design showcase than a home. This is, Emma started but couldn't find the words. Too much? Blake offered, amused. Excessive. Blake laughed. You'll get used to it. Emma didn't respond. She wandered through the space, trying to take it all in. The apartment had an almost oppressive silence, as if no one truly lived there. Despite all the luxury, it felt empty, soulless. Where's all your stuff? She asked, turning to Blake. My stuff? Yeah. Books, photos, anything that shows who you are. Blake hesitated before answering. I'm not really the type to keep a lot of things. Emma raised an eyebrow, but decided not to push. Instead, she sat down on the enormous couch in the living room, feeling smaller than ever. Okay, so what happens now? You want me to just stay here and pretend we're a happy couple? Exactly that, Blake said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Emma sighed. Do you have a plan for this, or are we just winging it? Blake smiled, grabbing a folder from a nearby table. Of course I have a plan. The first step is to start showing up at events together. The more people see us, the more they'll believe the story. Emma glanced at the folder, skeptical. You've really taken this seriously, haven't you? I take everything seriously, he replied, his tone more genuine than arrogant. Emma grabbed the folder and started flipping through the papers. Inside was a detailed schedule with galas, dinners, and even a planned trip. This is too much, she said, shutting the folder and tossing it back onto the table. It's what's necessary, Blake replied with a casual smile. Emma felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. The man was a mystery, and as irritating as he was, she couldn't deny that part of her wanted to understand what lay behind that confident facade. Fine, she said finally, but I have one condition. Another one? Blake asked, feigning exasperation. Yes, if I'm going to be part of this, I want to live my life normally. I'll keep working, studying, and taking care of my mum. Blake frowned. Working? You don't need to anymore. It's not about need, it's about who I am. For a moment, Blake looked like he was about to argue, but he sighed instead. Fine, but just know that'll draw attention. Then deal with it, Emma said, standing up from the couch. Blake chuckled softly, almost impressed. I think I'm going to enjoy being married to you. Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't quite hide a small smile. The first few days in Blake's apartment were uncomfortable for Emma. The expansive, luxurious space felt alien compared to the small Hoboken apartment where she'd spent most of her life. Every corner seemed too bright, too organized. There was no sign that anyone actually lived there. Even so, Emma tried to stay focused on why she had agreed to this. The contract was clear. 6 months. She would live with Blake, attend events, and play the role of his wife. After that, they would part ways and Emma would have the freedom and the money to rebuild her life. That morning, Emma was perched on a high chair in the kitchen, nibbling on toast while scribbling in a notebook. Blake walked in, as impeccably dressed as always, wearing a navy blue suit. He paused when he saw her, surprised to find someone so at ease in his home. Are you writing? He asked, picking up a freshly brewed cup of coffee from the automatic machine. Emma glanced up briefly, hesitating. Yeah, it's a hobby. Blake looked at the notebook with interest. but Emma quickly closed it. "It's personal," she said before he could ask more questions. "Fair enough, but you know, if it's something interesting, I can help you get it published." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "No thanks, I'd rather do it on my own." Blake shrugged as if he didn't mind and sat down at the table. He seemed distracted, scrolling through his phone while finishing his coffee. Emma studied him for a moment, trying to figure him out. Despite all his confidence and charm, there was something about Blake that felt incomplete. "Don't you think it's weird?" she asked suddenly. Blake looked at her, confused. "What? This? All of it? Us? Married?" Blake gave a small smile, leaning forward. "It's an arrangement, Emma. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to work." Emma sighed but didn't respond. It was clear he saw marriage as a transaction, a means to an end. But for her, it was impossible not to feel the weight of the commitment, even if it was fake. That evening, the couple's first event was scheduled. Blake had left a dress for Emma in her room, a stunning black silk piece that looked straight out of a fashion magazine. When Emma saw it, she rolled her eyes. "Does he think I'm some kind of doll?" she muttered to herself. But knowing she had to play her part in the deal, Emma dressed up and did her best to look confident as she descended the stairs to meet him. Blake was waiting in the living room, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. When he saw Emma, he stopped for a moment, surprised. "Wow, you look amazing," he said, his voice sounding genuine. Emma felt uncomfortable with the compliment, but muttered a quick thank you before grabbing her purse. "Let's just get this over with," she said, brushing past him. Blake smiled, amused, and followed her to the elevator. The event was a charity dinner at a 5-star hotel in the heart of Manhattan. The ballroom was filled with business people and prominent figures, all impeccably dressed and exchanging small talk, while waiters circulated with trays of champagne. Emma felt the gazes fall on her the moment she walked in alongside Blake. While she knew she looked beautiful, she also knew she was an outsider in this world. "Relax," Blake said quietly as he guided her through the room. "You're with me." "That doesn't help," Emma replied, though she tried to smile anyway. The introductions began, and Blake greeted several people with his usual confidence. Emma stayed by his side, watching him transform. He was an excellent actor, exuding perfect charm that masked any hint of vulnerability. "So, this is your wife?" an older man asked, shaking Emma's hand. "Yes, this is Emma," Blake replied with a warm smile. Emma forced a smile and shook the man's hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." As the night wore on, Emma noticed many people looking at her with curiosity, as if trying to piece together what was going on between her and Blake. Some women whispered discreetly, and she caught snippets of phrases like, "I've never seen her before," and "She's definitely not part of our circle." Emma tried to ignore them, but the feeling of being out of place grew with every passing second. During a pause, while Blake chatted with a group of investors, Emma slipped out onto the ballroom's balcony, seeking a moment of solitude. The crisp night air was a relief after the stifling heat of the party. She gazed at the city lights, feeling small against the vastness of it all. "I thought you'd run away," Blake said, appearing behind her. Emma gave a small smile but didn't respond. "They can be a bit much," he continued, leaning on the railing beside her. "It's not that. I just don't understand why you insist on bringing me to these places. I don't belong here," she said, looking at him. Blake was silent for a moment before answering, "Maybe it's because you're the only thing here that feels real." Emma stared at him, surprised by his response. For a moment, he didn't seem like the confident, arrogant man she had met at McDonald's. There was something in his voice that sounded honest, even vulnerable. "Real or not, this is still weird," she muttered, looking away. Blake chuckled but said nothing more. The two of them stood in silence, gazing at the city below. In that moment, Emma realized that as much of a mystery as Blake was, maybe he wasn't so different from her after all. The weeks that followed were a test of endurance for Emma. Charity events, dinners with people she would never have met outside this arrangement, and endless sessions of forced smiles by Blake's side. It was like living on a stage, with the spotlight constantly trained on her. Although their relationship was purely contractual, Blake insisted on having her by his side at every important occasion. He seemed to understand the role they both had to play, but sometimes Emma felt he did it for reasons beyond mere obligation. One night, after an event at a luxurious rooftop in the heart of Manhattan, Emma and Blake returned to the apartment. The limousine was silent, but the weight of the evening still lingered in the air. "You're starting to get good at this," Blake said, breaking the silence. Emma glanced at him, exhausted, with a touch of irony on her lips. "Oh, thanks. It's been my lifelong dream to be an actress in the theater of the rich and powerful." Blake chuckled. "It's not that bad. You just need to learn to ignore the comments." Emma sighed, looking out the window at the city's bright lights. "It's not that simple. I'm not like them, Blake. I never will be." "Who said you need to be?" he replied, his tone more serious than usual. Emma turned to him, surprised by his response. For a moment, she saw something different in Blake's face. He seemed tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was something deeper, something he rarely let show. "You've never told me why you really did this," Emma said, shifting her tone. Blake hesitated, glancing away. "I already told you. It was a challenge, a bet." "No, there's more to it. I can see it in you. You act like you've got everything under control, but you don't, do you?" Blake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to face her, his gaze so intense it made Emma uncomfortable. "Do you think it's easy being me?" he asked at last. "Easy?" Emma laughed incredulously. "You have everything anyone could ever want." "Yeah, and none of it means anything," Blake retorted, his voice laden with a frustration that caught Emma off guard. She stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I grew up in a family where success was the only thing that mattered. My father controlled everything. My future, my career, even my personal life. When he died, everyone expected me to become a better version of him. But I'm not." Emma didn't know what to say. For the first time, Blake was showing something beyond his confident and carefree facade. "So you did this to prove something?" she asked cautiously. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure out who I really am." Emma stayed silent. As much as she hated to admit it, she was starting to understand Blake. He was as trapped by his family's expectations as she was by the responsibilities of her own life. "We all have our struggles, I guess," Emma said at last. Blake gave her a melancholy smile, something she'd never seen from him before. "And what's yours?" Emma looked at him, surprised by the question. "My mom's sick, multiple sclerosis. I work to help pay her medical bills and stay in college, but I don't know if I'll make it." Blake remained quiet, processing her words. "You never told me that. Why would I? It doesn't matter to you." "It does," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Emma looked away, uncomfortable with his intensity. "You don't need to worry, it's not part of the contract." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it. When they arrived at the apartment, they went their separate ways, but that conversation stayed with both of them. The next morning, Emma woke up to a call from Blake. He rarely bothered her in the mornings, so it caught her off guard. "What is it?" she asked, still groggy. "I'm waiting for you in the car." "What? Why?" "Get dressed. I'm taking you somewhere." Emma protested, but Blake insisted. She came downstairs to meet him 30 minutes later, still annoyed at being dragged out of her apartment. "Where are we going?" she asked, crossing her arms. Blake gave her a mysterious smile. "You'll see." They drove to a small cafe in Soho, a cozy spot far from the glamour Emma was starting to get used to. Blake chose a discreet corner table and ordered 2 coffees. "What are we doing here?" Emma asked, confused. "I wanted to show you something different." "Different how?" "Something outside my bubble." Emma couldn't help but smile. "Is this your attempt at being humble?" Blake laughed. "Something like that." As they sipped their coffee, they talked about things they'd never discussed before. Emma shared her dreams of becoming a writer, something she rarely talked about with anyone. Blake told stories about his childhood, about how he always felt pressured to be the best, to never fail. For a moment, they weren't the millionaire and the McDonald's cashier. They were just 2 people trying to find their place in the world. Emma realized Blake had more layers than she'd imagined, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, she started to feel that maybe he wasn't just the arrogant guy she'd met at that counter. The cafe in Soho marked the beginning of something different. Emma and Blake began to see more in each other than just contract partners. Their interactions became more natural, and the silences less awkward. Blake seemed genuinely interested in Emma, and she, though reluctant, started to notice the invisible scars he carried. But the following weeks brought new challenges. Our gala dinner was on the horizon, a high-profile event where Blake needed to bolster his public image, and by extension, that of their marriage. "I need you to look impeccable," he said, handing Emma a blue silk gown in a designer garment bag. Emma gave him a scornful look. "You make it sound like I'm just an extension of your image. That's not it. It's just that, well, the social circle we're stepping into is different. They expect a certain presentation. So you want me to pretend to be the perfect doll?" Emma crossed her arms, defiant. Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just want you to feel comfortable there. Maybe I'd feel comfortable being myself." Blake stared at her, realizing he'd chosen his words poorly. "You're right, be yourself. But please come with me. This is important." Emma noticed something different in his tone. Despite everything, he seemed genuinely concerned about the event, almost as if it was more personal than professional. "Fine, but only because I promised." On the night of the event, Emma descended the apartment stairs wearing the dress Blake had picked out. Despite her initial disdain, she had to admit the gown was stunning. The blue brought out her eyes and draped elegantly over her figure. When she entered the room, Blake was waiting, adjusting his tie in the mirror. When he saw her, his expression shifted. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, but he quickly smiled. "You look incredible." Emma felt her cheeks warm, but played it off. "Don't say it like you're surprised." Blake laughed. "I never underestimate you, Emma." On the way to the event, the silence in the car was different from that time on the way back from the registry office. It wasn't awkward. It was laden with something unspoken. When they arrived, the hall was filled with important figures, politicians, business leaders, celebrities. Emma felt the weight of the stairs as soon as she stepped in alongside Blake. He greeted everyone with confidence, holding her hand firmly, as if declaring to the world that she was part of his life. But Emma knew many of them didn't accept her. The women looked at her with disdain, and the men seemed intrigued, as if trying to figure out who this stranger by Blake Harrison's side was. "You're doing great," Blake murmured, noticing the tension in Emma's shoulders. She cast him a sidelong glance. "I don't know how you put up with this. It's a habit." Before they could continue, an elegant woman approached them. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and haute couture red dress turned heads. "Blake, darling," she said with a fake smile. "We finally meet, Charlotte," he replied in a neutral tone. Charlotte ignored Emma completely, as if she were invisible. "I heard you got married. I thought it was just a rumor," she said, casting a superficial glance at Emma. "No, it's true," Blake replied, maintaining his composure. "This is Emma, my wife." Emma extended her hand politely, but Charlotte simply looked at her with a condescending smile. "Delighted," Charlotte said before turning back to Blake. "I hope we can talk later in private." Emma felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't just Charlotte's rudeness that unsettled her. It was the way she seemed to claim a special place in Blake's life. When Charlotte walked away, Emma looked at Blake. "She's interesting." Blake gave a tired smile. "Charlotte is the daughter of one of my main investors. She likes to think she has more power than she actually does." It seemed like more than that. Blake frowned, picking up on the tone in her voice. "Don't worry about her. Charlotte loves creating stories." Emma wanted to push further but decided to let it go. During dinner, Emma felt isolated. While Blake was caught up in business discussions, she sat alone at the table, trying to ignore the stares and whispers around her. It was like being surrounded by predators, judging her mercilessly. When she finally escaped to the terrace of the hall, she took a deep breath, relieved to be away from the suffocating environment. "I knew I'd find you here," Blake's voice came from behind her. Emma turned around, surprised. "I thought you were busy impressing the rich and powerful." Blake smiled, leaning against the railing beside her. "I needed a break. From me or from them?" "From them. You. I can handle." Emma couldn't help but give a small smile. "I don't know how you do it." Blake shrugged, looking out at the city lights. "It's the world I know. Doesn't mean I like it." Emma stayed silent, trying to decipher this man who seemed so torn between who he was and who he needed to be. "Why did you choose me?" she finally asked. Blake turned to her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean? At McDonald's? Why me? It could have been anyone else." Blake hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "Because you didn't seem impressed by me. In fact, I think you hated me right off the bat." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "And that was enough?" "It was different. And I needed something different." Emma felt something strange stir in her chest. For the first time, she believed Blake. "Maybe I'm starting to understand you," she murmured. Blake smiled. "That would be a miracle." They both fell silent again, watching the city sprawled out below them. And for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. The days following the dinner brought a new dynamic between Emma and Blake. They began to feel less like strangers, forced to coexist, and more like companions who shared a secret. Blake, who had once seemed like nothing more than an arrogant, shallow millionaire, revealed a more human side, and Emma, despite her reservations, began to lower her guard. One morning, as Emma brewed coffee in the sleek, minimalist kitchen of the apartment, Blake appeared, wearing a casual shirt and jeans. It was the first time she had seen him not impeccably dressed to impress. "Good morning," he said, leaning against the counter. "Morning. Weird seeing you without a suit," Emma replied, handing him a cup of coffee. Blake gave a small smile. "I decided to take a day off from being formal." Emma raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what does that mean?" "Let's go for a drive." Emma gave him a skeptical look. "I'm not interested in another dinner or an event full of people staring at me like I'm an alien. It's nothing like that. I promise." After a moment's hesitation, Emma agreed. An hour later, the two of them were in Blake's car, driving out of Manhattan. The urban landscape gradually gave way to quieter streets, trees, and open spaces. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, looking out the window. "I can't tell you. It's a surprise." "You're being very mysterious." Blake just laughed and kept driving. Eventually, the car pulled up in front of a secluded park, surrounded by tall trees. The place felt peaceful, almost as if it were miles away from the chaos of New York City. "A park?" Emma asked as she got out of the car. "I thought you might enjoy some peace and quiet. Besides, there's something here I want to show you." Blake led Emma along a trail to an area with a small lake surrounded by benches. It was simple, yet charming. Emma sat on one of the benches, gazing at the water that mirrored the blue sky above. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, intrigued. Blake sat beside her, looking more relaxed than Emma had ever seen him. "When I was a kid, my dad used to bring me here sometimes, not because he wanted to spend time with me, but because he needed a quiet place to think." "And what about you?" Emma asked. "What did you do while he thought?" Blake gave a wistful smile. "I'd wander off on my own, exploring. It was one of those rare moments where I could just be me, without any expectations." Emma looked at him, surprised by the confession. "You seem like someone who grew up surrounded by people. I grew up surrounded by people who wanted something from me. It's not the same." Emma stayed silent, taking in his words. In some ways, she understood what he meant. Despite their differences, both of them knew what it was like to carry a weight heavier than they should. "And you?" Blake asked, looking at her. "Any memories like that?" Emma thought for a moment before answering. "My mum used to take me to a bookstore near our house. It was our spot. Whenever things got tough, we'd go there and spend hours reading. It was like a refuge." Blake smiled. "Sounds like a good place." It was. But after she got sick, she stopped going out. "I haven't been back there since." Blake frowned as if something had just occurred to him. "Do you miss it?" Emma shrugged. "I guess so, but I don't like to dwell on what I've lost. I prefer to focus on what I can still do." Blake looked at her for a long moment, as if he was seeing something in her he hadn't noticed before. "You're amazing, you know that." Emma was at a loss for words. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "I'm not. I just do what I have to. That's what makes you amazing." Emma looked away, trying to hide the smile threatening to show. That night, back at the apartment, Emma went to Blake's office, where he was sitting in front of his computer, seemingly absorbed in work. "Can I interrupt you for a moment?" she asked, knocking lightly on the door. Blake looked up and smiled. "Of course, what's up?" Emma stepped inside, hesitating before she spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you. For the park. For everything today. It was nice." Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Emma stood at the door for a moment before leaving. But just before she closed the door, she heard Blake call her name. "Emma." "Yes, it was nice for me too," she smiled, closing the door behind her. That night, as Emma wrote in her notebook, she realized something she'd been trying to ignore. Blake wasn't just the arrogant millionaire she'd first met. He was a man full of flaws, but also a depth she hadn't expected. And against all her expectations, she began to wonder what would happen when the 6 months were over. The months passed in a blur between social events, quiet nights at the apartment, and occasional moments of connection. Emma and Blake started getting used to each other's presence. What had started as a cold contract was turning into something neither of them had anticipated. But the contract still lingered, like a shadow hanging over everything they were building. Each passing day brought Emma closer to the end of the agreement, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. One night, while Blake was at a meeting away from the apartment, Emma sat alone on the couch with her notebook. The words didn't come easily. She tried to write about other people, about imaginary stories, but her mind kept drifting back to Blake. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Blake walked in, looking exhausted, but still carrying the same effortless charm as always. "Working on something important?" he asked, nodding toward the notebook. Emma quickly closed it and shrugged. "Just trying to write. Nothing special." Blake sat down beside her, loosening his tie. "You're so secretive about it. Will you ever let me read what you write?" "Maybe someday," she replied with an enigmatic smile. They sat in silence for a moment, simply enjoying the quiet. Blake looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly. Emma turned to him surprised. "About what?" "About you. About what happens when all this is over." Emma felt her stomach flip. It was the conversation she'd been avoiding. "The contract, you mean?" Blake nodded, staring at his hands. "Yeah, the contract. I know we said this would just be an arrangement, but..." He trailed off, as though carefully choosing his words. "But?" Emma prompted, her heart racing. Blake sighed, finally meeting her eyes. "I don't want this to end." Emma was speechless. For a moment, everything around her seemed to stop. "Blake, we agreed this would be temporary." "I know," he interrupted. "But what if it doesn't have to be?" Emma shook her head, confused and fighting the emotions bubbling to the surface. "Blake, that doesn't make sense. We started this all wrong. It was a bet. An agreement." "I know it was. But Emma, it's different now." "We're different." She stared at him, searching his eyes for any hint he might be joking. But Blake seemed completely serious. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, feeling vulnerable. Blake leaned forward, taking her hand. "Then don't say anything right now. Just think about it." Emma nodded slowly, still in shock over his confession. In the days that followed, Blake's words echoed in her mind. She tried to ignore them, focusing on work and school, but it was impossible. He had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to deal with what that meant. Blake, on the other hand, seemed calmer than ever. He continued to treat her with the same kindness he'd shown over the past few months, but now there was something more in his actions. He was being more patient, more present. One afternoon, as they walked through Central Park, Blake brought up the topic again. "Emma, have you thought about what I said?" Emma sighed, stopping near a fountain. "I have, but I don't know what to do with it." Blake slipped his hands into his pockets, watching her. "I just want to know one thing." "What?" she asked cautiously. "Do you feel anything for me?" Emma was silent. It was a simple question, but the answer felt so complicated. She knew she felt something, but admitting it would mean letting go of the safety she'd built by keeping Blake at an emotional distance. "Blake, that's not fair. I'm not trying to be unfair. I just want to know where we stand." Emma took a deep breath, trying to find the words. "I don't know what I feel. You're unexpected. I never thought this would happen." "Neither did I," he admitted. They stood in silence, watching the fountain's water bubble and swirl. "Maybe we should take a step back and think about it when all this is over," Emma suggested. Blake frowned. "And what if, when it's all over, it's too late?" "I don't know, Blake. I don't know if I can trust this." "Trust you?" Blake stepped back as if he'd been struck. "I understand, but I want you to know that, for me, this is real." Emma felt a tightness in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of getting hurt was stronger. That night, when they returned to the apartment, Emma sat on the couch, gazing at the city through the massive windows. Blake went to his office, and the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Finally, Emma opened her notebook and began to write. The words flowed like never before. She wrote about everything she was feeling: her confusion, her fear, and most of all, the growing hope she could no longer ignore. When she finished, she looked at the last sentence she'd written. "Maybe it's time to take a chance." Emma closed the notebook, feeling slightly lighter, but at the same time she knew she would have to make a decision that would change everything. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Emma. Blake had laid his cards on the table, making his feelings clear, but she still wasn't sure if she could fully trust him or herself. Still, the dynamic between them continued to shift. Blake was more careful, more present, as if he wanted to show her that his words were genuine. Emma, on the other hand, started to realize she was more vulnerable to him than she wanted to admit. One afternoon, when Emma came home from work, she found a surprise. In the center of the living room was a stack of books with a small note on top. She picked up the paper and read, "For you to keep dreaming, Blake." Emma ran her fingers over the covers. They were classic literature books. Some she'd casually mentioned in conversation, and others she had always wanted to read but never had the chance to buy. She sighed, holding the note longer than she intended. Blake was going above and beyond what any agreement required. That night, the two had dinner together, something that had become more frequent in recent weeks. As Blake poured wine into their glasses, Emma looked at him, determined to finally address the subject she'd been avoiding. "You've been trying pretty hard lately," she said casually. Blake raised an eyebrow, sensing the tone in her voice. "Is that a bad thing?" "No, but it makes me wonder." "Why?" Blake leaned his elbows on the table, interlacing his fingers. "Do you want the honest answer?" Emma nodded, holding her glass between her hands. "Because I want you to trust me, not because of the contract, but because of what we're building." She frowned, still wrestling with doubt. "Blake, I don't know if I can." He leaned forward, his voice softer. "Then tell me what I need to do." Emma stayed silent, staring at the man in front of her. He seemed so different from the Blake Harrison who had walked into McDonald's months ago, proposing an outrageous marriage. Now he genuinely seemed willing to do whatever it took to prove he was serious. "You can't force this, Blake. Trust takes time." He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Then I'll wait." The next morning, Emma was met with another surprise. When she walked into the living room, she found Blake on the phone, apparently handling something important. As soon as he hung up, she crossed her arms, waiting for an explanation. "What are you up to now?" she asked, suspicious. Blake smiled, as if he enjoyed keeping her in suspense. "Nothing much. I just thought you might like to take a day off from work." "Blake, I can't just take a day off." Yes, you can. I already talked to your boss. Everything's sorted." Emma opened her mouth to protest, but Blake interrupted her. "Trust me, just this once." Despite her reluctance, she agreed. A few hours later, they were in Hoboken at the small apartment where Emma used to live with her mum before the contract. "What are we doing here?" Emma asked as they climbed the stairs. You'll see. When they reached the door, Emma froze upon seeing her mother, Linda, standing in the hallway with an emotional smile on her face. Mom! Emma exclaimed, rushing to hug her. Emma! Sweetheart! What a surprise! Emma turned to Blake, confused. You brought my mom here. Well, technically she still lives here, but I thought you two needed some time together, so I offered to help with a few things. Linda looked at Blake with gratitude. This man showed up out of nowhere with a new chair, blankets, and even medication. I didn't know what to think. Emma felt a lump in her throat. You did this? She asked, incredulous. Blake shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. It wasn't a big deal, but to Emma it was. She knew how much her mom needed those things, and the fact that Blake had done it without expecting anything in return left her speechless. While Linda chatted animatedly, Emma stepped away to a window, trying to collect her thoughts. Blake followed, stopping beside her. You didn't have to do that, Blake. I know, but I wanted to. Emma looked into his eyes, searching for something, any sign that he had ulterior motives, but all she found was sincerity. Why? She asked, almost in a whisper. Blake gave a small smile. Because I care about you, Emma. She felt his words hit something inside her that she had been trying to ignore. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe he might be telling the truth. Back in the apartment, Emma sat in her room, staring at the open notebook in her hands. The phrase she had written a few days earlier came back to her. Maybe it's time to take a chance. She knew she couldn't keep running from her feelings. Blake was trying to be a better person, and she couldn't pretend anymore that it didn't affect her. That night, while he was in the office, Emma knocked on the door, hesitant. Blake, do you have a minute? He looked up, surprised, but smiled. Always. Emma stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About us. Blake leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to continue. I think I might be ready to trust you. Blake's eyes lit up, but he didn't interrupt. I'm still scared. I still think this is complicated, but I think it's worth a try. Blake stood up, walking over to her with a smile that seemed to mix relief and happiness. You won't regret this, Emma, I promise. She smiled, a little shy but genuine. I hope not. In that moment, something shifted between them. For the first time, it wasn't about contracts, bets, or obligations. It was about two people from completely different worlds, deciding to try something real. Blake took a step forward, close enough for Emma to feel the warmth of his presence. His eyes were locked on hers, filled with a sincerity that disarmed her. Emma, I don't know how to explain this, but you've changed everything for me, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emma stared at him, her heart racing. Her doubts were still there, but in that moment something stronger took over, the feeling that maybe taking a risk wasn't a mistake. Blake hesitated for a moment, as if giving her the chance to back away, but Emma didn't move. Then slowly he leaned in and his lips touched hers. The kiss began cautiously, almost timidly, but soon deepened, as if both were trying to say everything they hadn't been able to until now. Emma felt the world around her disappear, leaving only that moment, that man who, against all odds, had managed to break through her walls. When they pulled apart, Blake kept his face close to hers, still breathing deeply. I don't know if I deserve you, but I want to try to prove that I do, he murmured. Emma smiled, her eyes still shining with the emotions of the moment. Then you'd better make it worth it. Blake chuckled softly, touching her face with gentle fingers. You can bet I will. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between Emma and Blake changed completely. What had once been a relationship marked by obligations and formalities became something lighter, more intimate. Emma began to let her guard down, allowing herself to feel something that had once seemed impossible. Blake, on the other hand, did everything he could to show that his intentions were genuine, a sincerity that increasingly felt natural to him. One night, after dinner, they sat on the couch in the living room. The city lights sparkled beyond the enormous windows, but the comfortable silence between them was what stood out the most. Blake was flipping through a book Emma had left on the table, while she gazed distractedly at the cityscape. Do you think we're ready to face the world? Emma asked, breaking the silence. Blake closed the book and looked at her thoughtfully. I don't think we're ever really ready for that, but maybe the secret is not trying to face it all alone. Emma chuckled softly, leaning against the arm of the couch. You always have an answer for everything. Not always, only when I'm around you. Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. You're impossible. You know that. That's what they say. The playful tone of their conversation masked something deeper. Both of them knew the end of the contract was approaching, and with it, the decision to stay together or go their separate ways. The next morning, Blake announced he wanted to take her to one more event. This time it was a dinner at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant, where friends and important business contacts would be present. Another one of those events where everyone looks at me like I'm an imposter? Emma asked, sipping her coffee. No, not at all. I want you to come because I want people to see you the way I see you. Emma looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. And how do you see me? Blake smiled, setting his mug in the sink. As someone far more incredible than I could ever deserve. Emma felt her heart tighten. He was no longer the arrogant man who had walked into McDonald's months ago. Blake was changing, and she knew part of that had to do with her. All right, she said finally. But if anyone asks me about burgers, you're going to save me. Blake laughed, and I promise. The restaurant was packed with important people. When Blake walked in with Emma by his side, all eyes inevitably turned toward them. This time, Emma felt less uncomfortable. Maybe it was because Blake held her hand firmly in his, or maybe it was because, at last, she was beginning to feel more at ease with him. Amid conversations and introductions, Blake treated her as if she were the only person in the room. He included her in every discussion, praised her intelligence, and subtly made it clear she was more than just his wife. When they finally had a moment alone, Emma pulled him aside, stepping away from the crowd. You're overdoing it, you know, she said, crossing her arms. Blake tilted his head, puzzled. What do you mean? You don't need to put me on a pedestal. I'm just me. Blake gave a small smile, holding her hands. Exactly. And that's enough for me. Emma felt her face heat up, but before she could respond, a familiar figure approached. It was Charlotte, the woman from the previous dinner. Oh, Emma, darling, Charlotte said with a fake smile. How lovely to see you again. Emma tried to smile back, but Charlotte's condescending tone was hard to ignore. Charlotte, she replied with a brief nod. Blake, I had no idea you had such an incredible talent for finding rarities. The veiled insult was impossible to miss. Emma felt her blood boil, but before she could respond, Blake stepped in. Charlotte, Emma is rare, yes, but in a way you could never understand. Blake's tone was firm but polite, and Charlotte seemed taken aback by his defense. Well, I didn't mean it like that, Charlotte began, but her voice faltered under Blake's steady gaze. Then perhaps we should end this conversation here, he said, taking Emma's hand and walking away. Emma followed him, feeling relieved and grateful. Thank you, she said, once they were far enough away. For what? For standing up for me. Blake looked at her, his eyes soft. I'll always stand up for you, Emma. Back at the apartment that night, Emma felt more confused than ever. Sitting on the couch with one of the books Blake had given her in her lap, she mulled over everything that had happened in recent months. When Blake sat down beside her, she finally found the courage to say what she'd been avoiding. Blake, the contract ends in 2 weeks. Blake paused as if he'd been waiting for her to say it. I know, and what happens after that? Blake took a deep breath, looking at her with a mix of nervousness and determination. That depends on you. On me? She asked, frowning. Yes, I want to stay with you, Emma. Not because we're bound by a contract, but because I want you in my life. Emma's heart raced. He was opening up completely, without holding back. Blake, she began, but he interrupted her. I know this won't be easy. We're different. We come from opposite worlds, but I want to try. I want this to be real. Emma stayed silent for a long moment, letting his words sink in. Finally, she looked at him and smiled softly. Then let's try. Blake looked relieved, almost surprised. Really, really. Before she could say anything else, Blake leaned in and kissed her again. This time the kiss was deeper, more meaningful, as if they were sealing a new agreement, not based on contracts but on what they truly felt for each other. When they pulled apart, Emma smiled, looking at him with more certainty than she'd ever had before. I think we're ready to face the world now. Blake chuckled softly, gently touching her face. Together, we can face anything. So what did you think of this story? Do you believe love can start from a bet and turn into something real? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories. There's something new almost every day, and there are even more incredible stories waiting for you. Click on the videos popping up on the screen now, and keep getting inspired with us.